And we're all set to go. Good afternoon. I'm Marcia Connolly for the Association of Lifelong Learners. So glad to see you all here with us. Today we have Joe Gentry, who's familiar to many of you as a adjunct professor
Yeah.
here at
One point in
Alpena
time.
Community College, as well as being on the Board of Trustees and the United Way Director for Northeast Michigan. He is going to be presenting a program on global tipping points, of which I'm glad to hear there are some positives as well as the
Yes, there
negatives.
is.
So we're going to learn more about that. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Mark. So how does an economist or somebody who teaches economy end up talking about global tipping points? 2 years ago, I was asked to fill in for teaching economics at ACC because the regular professor retired very hurriedly and just before the semester started. So Nick Breggy and I stepped up and I said, yeah, I'd do that, even though I hadn't been back in the classroom for 15 plus years. So one of the nice things was they gave me the syllabus from the lady who retired. And I was able to look at the syllabus and decide about the curriculum and what topics are new. 15 years, economics does change because you talk about present stuff, not just the basics like supply and demand. And I found in her syllabus reference to this book called The Tipping Point, a book by Malcolm Caldwell. So I thought, that's interesting. He's kind of a social writer. He writes about all kinds of social events. And so I picked up the book. And that book led me to where I am today talking about global tipping points, because the global tipping points impact economies, and it impacts the whole world. And back in 2006, when Al Gore put out the movie Inconvenient Truths, I was a unbeliever, frankly. I thought, well, this is just not scientifically all correct, that we have a much longer period of time to wait and see that these calamities are going to happen, that these tipping points would be released. I'd invite you all to go back after I talk a little bit today about global tipping points and go look back at that video, Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore in 2006. Much of what he said and talked about back then is coming true today. So Malcolm Caldwell, in his book Tipping Points, he studied things that were going on in society, and he talks about a tipping point is that magic moment when an idea, a trend, or a social behavior crosses a threshold tip. It's like a boiling point and spreads like wildfire. Just as a single sick person can, pass on the flu to many and create an epidemic, so can the popularity of new products, the drops in crime rates, the spreading of gonorrhea and AIDS. I mean, those are all the issues he studied to try to understand tipping points. And he identified in tipping points, there's three things that make it happen. Number one, it's got to be contagious. And global environmental tipping points are contagious because it's like a domino effect. And it's not gradual, but it's dramatic and it's impactful today. So it's not this long, gradual process to popularize something. It's kind of like COVID. It's automatic. It happens with significant dramatic impact, and it happens in a very short period of time. And the third point was little causes can have dramatic effects. And in the book, he goes through three things, or a number of stories. The one I liked most was about hush puppies. Hush puppies were, in the 50s, very, very popular, 60s, kind of diminished. In 1995, hush puppies only sold 135,000 pairs of shoes until some kids in New York started wearing hush puppies. And it became a fashion statement. And the following year, they sold 1.7 million pair. And so what was it? Hush puppies hadn't changed. They hadn't marketed anymore. They had an influencer, small group in New York, who made them a fashion trend. Okay? He talked about the crime rate in New York from the 1960s to the about the early 1990s, the crime rate was very steady. 200,000 violent crimes, 12,000 to 15,000 murders, up into the upper 60s, right to the 1990s. It stayed that. No matter what kind of programs they put in place, what kind of police and law enforcement stuff, then all of a sudden in 1992, the crime rate fell dramatically and quickly. And so he tried to identify what was the real causal factors. Was it better law enforcement? Was it the fact that the users, the people that were tending to be prone for crime, decided to be non-crime, anti-crime? And so crime just kind of really fell off the ledge. And he did the same thing by studying gonorrhea in Colorado and the AIDS epidemic as it started. It had a couple of fine people or individual small people that spread the diseases. It wasn't massive of people spreading it. It was a couple of people that infected many people down the line. So this thing of the tipping point is, and he used this experiment, and he said, if I handed you a piece of paper, an 8 by half and 11 piece of paper, and I asked you to fold it in half, and then I asked you to fold that in half, and then I asked you to fold that in half for 50 times, how high or how tall would that stack of paper be? Most people answer, oh, as thick as a phone book, or as thick as, or as high as a refrigerator. In reality, if you took a piece of paper and folded it 50 times in half, the stack would reach from here to the sun. And on the 51st fold, it would come back to Earth, that distance. It's called geometric progression. It's unbelievable. But that's what happens with tipping points. You have this geometric progression. So today, we have global tipping points in our environment. I got some handouts that will help. So the tipping point is that example up on the top, where you have this equilibrium. And you're in this place, in this trough where everything's good, and you have to get pushed up the hill to go over the tipping point and then hit another static position. Or what is happening today is the tipping point, the hill is becoming lower, and the tipping point curve is dropping off because of dramatic changes, so that eventually you end up in the third stage with being way down in the bottom. So your new level of steady state is much lower than it was. That's just a dynamic example of what we talk about tipping point. So there is this group called the Tipping Point, Global Tipping Point report that came out in 2023 by Exeter University. And it's about a 600-page document full of all kinds of wonderful statistics and data that is very alarming if you read it. And you can see the picture that they have below, and they talk about the 20 issues that we have to deal with for global environmental tipping points. There's some in the biosphere, like tropical dry forests, tropical rainforests, regular boreal forests, like in Canada, the tundra, which is northern Canada and Siberia, savanna and grasslands, and then dry lands. There's lakes and coral reefs and mangroves, fisheries, seagrass, and kelp forests. Those are all their own identities in our biosphere. And then they talk about the cryosphere, which is the ice in the cold lands, the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the non-marine East Antarctica, the marine basins in East Antarctica, the permafrost, mountain glaciers. And then the third sphere that we talk about are ocean and atmospheric circulation. As you know, the North Atlantic has a circulation that runs to the South Pole. There's subpolar gyre, which is a gyre is a wave. That's that current. The subpolar current is what is up around Greenland and the North Pole. And then the Southern Ocean overturning, which means that you have windy conditions that allow colder water beneath the warm surface water to replace that warm surface water that keeps the oceans cool. And then there's the Western African monsoons. And that is that part of the ocean where many of the hurricanes that hit our country and the Caribbean and Mexico, that's where they're based out of that West African monsoon area. And so you can see they've identified them by color so you get an idea of where these particular spheres are. And then it talks about which ones are near their tipping point, already beyond their tipping point. A, coral reefs. The coral reefs in Australia in the last 4 years have had 5 whiting or blanchings, where the whole coral reef turns white. And then the reefs start to die. And coral reefs are the richest area in our oceans that provide for marine life, for all marine life. And it's critical to keep coral reefs alive. The coral reefs in the Caribbean and off of Florida, same thing. They've had this severe blanching, and it happens because the water's too warm. Key West last summer, if you stepped off of Key West, so the ocean temperature was 88 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than your bathtub probably. That's the ocean. And so these corals cannot exist and live in those, and we know already that coral reefs are probably beyond their tipping point unless something can be done. The Greenland ice sheet is melting. In 5 to 6 years, they say we might have a green Greenland, no ice. It's beyond its tipping point, and how much of the ice in Greenland is disappearing. The West Antarctic ice sheet, I just read yesterday about the huge chunk of ice that broke off Antarctica in the freshwater marine area and now is floating into the ocean. It's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So it's beyond right now its tipping point. And the permafrost. And that is northern Canada and all of that Siberian and the northern European states where they have permafrost. The permafrost is melting. One of the side effects of permafrost melting, it's got gigatons of methane stored in it that will be released. And once it's released, it will increase global warming by raising the gas levels in the atmosphere with methane. So these are serious issues. And the subpolar gyre, I'm going to give you another handout talks about ocean temperatures, but the subpolar one is the one that goes in the North Atlantic. They're actually talking about it's slowing down, and the current is slowing down, which will change the whole structure of the ocean. So these are serious tipping points. Now, in our history, every 100 million years in history, there's been 5 mass extinctions. Right? The first one was 444 million years ago, and it was called, it's right at the end of the Ordovician era, and 86% of the species on the planet disappeared. Okay? And it was caused by intense glacial periods, might think of it as ice age. The sea levels varied up and down, and there was a tectonic shift that brought up the Appalachian Mountains. They raised the Appalachian Mountains. And so that, again, when that all occurred right at the end of the Ordovician era, 86% of the species on the planet went away. The next one was in 360 million years ago, about 100 million years later, was the late Devonian period. And 75% of the species that existed at that time disappeared. And that was caused by rapid growth of land plants. They had a global warming that occurred, and the land plants took over the planet, and the growth in the land plants raised the global temperature so that Most species couldn't survive, and 75% of the species on the planet died, disappeared. The third massive extinction was 250 million years ago, again, another 100 million years later, and 96% of the species on the planet disappeared. And that was caused primarily by intense volcanic action that occurred in Siberia. And it caused tremendous global warming. It elevated the sulfur dioxide and the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and the ocean became acidic, and we had acid rain. And so again, 96% of these species on the planet disappeared. About 50 million years after that was the end of the Triassic period, and that was around 200 million years ago. 80% of the species that existed at that time, they disappeared. And that was caused because of underwater volcanoes in the central Atlantic, and it caused significant global warming, and it changed the makeup and the chemistry of the oceans, so that much of marine life passed away and died, as did many of the species on land. 80% of the species disappeared. The last and the fifth mass extinction was 65 million years ago. And that was the end of the Cretaceous period, and that was caused by that huge meteorite that went into the ocean at the Yucatan Peninsula. And that eliminated the dinosaurs. And it eliminated 76% of the species that were on the planet at that time. So don't think that, this is unique, this global warming thing. Global warming has been the cause in all 5 of the mass extinctions that have occurred in the history of the planet. It's been global warming, caused significantly by global warming. When the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula, it created huge tidal waves, and it also threw fireballs into the air, and the fireballs landed, destroyed forests, burnt everything, and it actually wiped out all the dinosaurs, and not very many species survived. That was 65 million years ago. So the history shown, like about every 100 million years, or somewhere between 50 to 100 million years, there's another mass extinction. We need to act now, or we're going to face the same kind of mass extinction caused by global warming. It's very clear and very, very simple. I want to read you the narrative from this global tipping points report, because I think it really points the finger directly on what's going on. Harmful tipping points in the natural world pose some of the gravest threats to humanity. Their triggering will severely damage our planet's life support systems and threaten the stability of our societies. For example, the collapse of the Atlantic Ocean's great overturning circulation, combined with global warming, could cause half of the global area for growing wheat and maize to be lost. 5 major tipping points are already at risk of being crossed due to warming right now, and 3 more are threatened in the years 2030 as the world exceeds 1.5 degrees centigrade increases. The full damage caused by negative tipping points will be far greater than their initial impact. The effects will cascade through globalized social and economic systems and could exceed the ability of some countries to adapt. Negative tipping points show that the threat posed by the climate and ecological crisis is far more severe than is commonly understood and is of a magnitude never before faced by humanity. They used to describe these things as being low impact, low probability. Now they're high impact, high probability events. Currently, there is no adequate global governance at the scale of the threats posed by negative tipping points. The world is on a disastrous trajectory. Crossing one harmful tipping point could trigger others, causing a domino effect of accelerating and unmanageable change to our life support system. Preventing this and doing so equitably should become the core goal and logic of a new global governance framework. Prevention is only possible if societies and economic systems are transformed to rapidly, once again, rapidly reduce emissions and restore nature. The current approach of linear incremental change favored by many decision makers is no longer an option. Existing governance institutions and decision-making approaches need to adapt to facilitate transformational change. Crucial to achieving this transformational change are positive tipping point opportunities. Again, positive opportunities, where desirable changes in society become self-propelling. Concerted actions can create the enabling conditions for triggering rapid and large-scale transformation. Human history is flushed with examples of abrupt, exponential increases in social and technological change. Recent examples include the exponential increases in renewable electricity. Right today, the investment in solar generated power is greater than the investments being made in gas and oil. That's a good example. The global reach of environmental justice movements and the accelerating rollout of electrical vehicles is another good example. Negative tipping point threats could be mitigated if there was a vast effort to trigger other positive tipping point opportunities, and I'll talk about some of those. Unfortunately, in the time lag during which appropriate governance and action might be realized, negative tipping points could still be triggered. This means that societies must urgently be made more resilient to minimize the vast and unequal harms. Critically, more resilient societies are also needed to ensure that collective focus on triggering positive tipping point opportunities can be sustained even though there's a negative tipping point event. This resiliency can be achieved with no regrets actions in any way make societies more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous. That's pretty damning language from a global report about global tipping points, but I believe it's real. I have another handout to help understand some of this.
Now, who is responsible for this?
It's Exeter University, and I have a scan thing where you can go and get the report from, but there's a bunch of there's, I don't know, scientists, many scientists have been working on this for about 10 years, that the University of Exeter, the Global Systems Institute, and it was funded by Jeff Bezos' Earth Fund. Their other report partners are Earth Commission, the Global Commons Alliance, and Systems Change Lab and System IQ. So there's all kinds of agencies, scientists, labs, and everything that have come together to put this report out there. And it's available online, and I will give you that information here shortly. So this is another illustration or issues about three concerns, three real concerns. One, the expanding world population. I mean, and they use the example of we're a finite planet. We don't have unlimited resources. We're finite, and all the decisions that we make go back to my economic background. Marginal revenue's got to exceed the marginal cost. You don't make that decision. Okay, which means that if the marginal cost is greater, if it costs me $5 to make something that brings back $4, I don't do that. Today, the decisions that we're making on a large economical and political status are, the marginal cost is far greater than the marginal benefit that we're getting from it. So how many people can the world support? So in 1937, there was 2.3 billion people. Today in 2020, there's 7.8 billion, almost 7.9 billion people. It's projected that by 2030, there's going to be 11 billion people on the planet. And there used to be this, what did they call it? uh, the Earth Overshoot Day. Back in 1987, they talked about the day on the yearly calendar where we're consuming more resources than in a year that the world can replace. In 1987, that day was October 23. Okay. So on October 23rd, we have used up all the resources the planet can provide currently for a whole year. So we're in a negative balance. By 2019, it was July 29th. And today we use up 1.7 of the resources that are available in 1 year for a year. So the world, and it's because of population growth. We have to support this population. And I put this little diagram up here, and they say there's 4 stages of sustainability in a population. You start way up here, you got a high birth rate, low death rate, so your population increases. And initially your death rate can be higher, lower, but it's about the same as the birth rate, but then at some point in time it drops right off. And then in stage 2, you're in this period where the size of the population is growing because of you're here, people are competitive, they're having, think back to the 50s and 60s, families had 4 to 5 children. Today, the average household has 1.8 in the United States anyway. Worldwide, it's like 2.2. So poverty creates overpopulation, believe it or not. Statistics will show that out. So what happens then is your birth rate eventually drops off. As you get more access, you become a little bit richer, your company or your country grows, and your birth rate in stage 4 is starting to match your death rate, and you hit a sustainable population size. And they use Japan as an example. Japan used to have about 16 million residents post World War II. Okay, and so they went through this. They went through step 2 in the 50s and in the 50s and 60s post World War II, and their population shrunk. Today it's right around 10 million people. Okay? And so now they talk about, well, Japan, because they have this birth and death rate so far, their population is aging, and so eventually the population is going to decline. China's experiencing the same thing today because of the one-child rule. Now they're encouraging citizens to have kids because we need to support our aging population. So this is an issue that how many people can the planet support? What is this stable population? And most scientists put that number around 10 to 11 billion people. Any more than that, it's unsustainable. Unsustainable. Okay. So we want to be sure we look at and pay attention to population, the world's population. The other big factor is carbon in the atmosphere. 1937, it was 280 parts per million. Today, it's 450 parts per million. Okay. We had a 1.2% Celsius increase, which is about almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, in increase in global atmosphere. And it's increasing. They're talking about by the end of 2024, it's potentially going to be 2.5%, a potential 2.5% increase, which again, it is disastrous for the global environment. One of the things that absorbs the most carbon on the planet is water, right? And so water, as the environment gets warmer, water evaporates, and that adds carbon back into the atmosphere. Not you and I creating it. It's created because, so you can see this domino effect. If we continue to burn fossil fuels and pump fossil fuel gases into the atmosphere and the temperature, the ambient temperature continues to raise, then waters will evaporate quicker. And as they evaporate, they're going to add even more carbon to the atmosphere. It's a domino effect, a geometric progression. And then the big fact, and I encourage you to, a couple of books that if this really interests you, is David Attenborough's book, A Life on This Planet. Fabulous book. Not all negative. It's just his observations from when he started his scientific life to where he sits today at 92 and what we need to be doing. And his big emphasis, the shrinking of wilderness, the biosphere, the shrinking of our biosphere, of this multiple species that exist together that balance one another. The remaining wilderness on the planet in 1937 was 66%. Today it's 35%, cut in half since 1937. And there's only 35% of the wilderness on our planet that's left. We'll talk about some of these points. Some of the other things. We extract 80 million tons of seafood yearly, and we've reduced by 30% our fish stocks, and our fish stocks currently are at critical levels. There are some programs called the MPAs, Marine Protection Areas, that are in place so that there's no fishing allowed. Some entities, some islands in the South Pacific have said we're no longer going to allow netting, and it all has to be hook and line, and we're only going to feed our people. We're not going to export fish anymore. So there are positive things that come about. We've lost 50% of the world's shallow water corals, and major whiting or bleaching is occurring. And when bleaching occurs, what is happening is the heat shakes off the algae and the plant growth that's on the corals, which all the other marine life feed on. And so you have really a coral system that's not adding anything to the rest of the marine life in the ocean. And then it's eventually dying if it goes on being blanched for so long. There is some research going on right now. I know in Australia, there's a huge laboratory where they're trying to grow heat-resistant coral and then planting it back in. They talk about ocean whitening, where they're actually putting visqueen over areas where the coral reefs are, so that evaporation doesn't occur, so that the water stays cooler, the corals can live. Right? So there are some things that are going on a positive basis. We all talk about seafood farming. I don't know if you go to Meijer or Walmart and you buy frozen seafood that isn't available here, it'll tell you, oh, farm raised. Well, not all farm raised is good. Because one of the things that happened in all these seafood aquaculture is they've eliminated the mangrove forests and also got rid of seagrass, which are vital areas for phytonutrients to grow and exist to feed the rest of the marine life. So they're actually destroying the environment when they remove the mangroves. So modern aquaculture is now moving out to deeper water, where it has less impact on shallow water and shallow water species development. It's a live and learn kind of experience, but it is getting better. And the feces and the waste that comes from these farms, these aquaculture farms, they're finding out ways to grow oysters and other things underneath the waste troughs created by the aquaculture. So what can we do as individuals? Look at what you're eating and buying, and make sure you're supporting an aquaculture that's environmentally safe and environment friendly. The disturbing one is plastic debris. I watched a program last night on NPR, Visioning the Future, and they talked about the amount of plastic waste that is in the ocean. It's unbelievable. They talk about, they've even found plastic waste in the deepest trenches in the Mariana Trench in the ocean. And they talked about how many tons of floating plastic waste there is in the Pacific. And they're trying to encapsulate it now and clean it up and deliver it. 90% of shorebirds or seabirds have plastic fragments in their stomach. One of the biggest pollutants in our Great Lakes today is microplastics. You and I washing our polyester clothes, and that's going into a wastewater treatment plant and is flowing back out into the Great Lakes. So anything that's not natural fabric, eventually is flowing through microplastics into our Great Lakes. I read a story yesterday in Oscoda where they took the lake foam that was on the beach in Oscoda, they packaged it and sent it to the lab, and it's full of PFAS. And now they're saying, don't mess with the foam on the Great Lake because it has these forever chemicals in the foam that's come through our groundwater system. So plastics are a huge environmental problem right now. Freshwater systems are threatened. There's 50,000 large water dams in the world that once used to be used to generate electricity. It's only about 4% of the global electrical grid. And many of them today, they're talking about undamming and letting the rivers flow free again. When you dam the river, you create warmer water. You create a different aquaculture that is high in algae. It doesn't allow migration of fish and other mammals because of the warm water that's now in the river. I know, much to the chagrin of some of these communities in Northeast Michigan, Consumers Power is looking at removing dams, the Loud Dam, along the Osable River because they're not cost effective anymore. And they want to take them out and restore the Osable River back to its normal state. Where that goes, who knows? But the fresh water, that is us removing fresh water from our environment when we put in dams. We build on floodplains and we drain wetlands. They're now 50% less than what they used to be back in the 30s. Floodplains, that's like the mouth of the rivers. We're developing them, and we're not replacing with other wetlands. Wetlands are vital for our biosphere. They act as cleansing agents. You see cattails around. That's one thing that breaks down some of the toxic chemicals that get spilled into the water system. They're just, it's not good. And we've eliminated the size of the animal population in wetlands and at our beachfronts by 80% because of our overuse of those areas. We cut down 15 billion trees each year. The rainforests have been reduced by 50%. And the top driver isn't buildings, isn't furniture, it's for beef production. All the trees that are being cut down in the Amazon are to create pasture land, to grow soy, to feed beef. One of the key things you'll find in the Global Tipping Report, we want to change anything, quit eating beef. Because farming is ridiculously environmentally hazardous. It has created this tipping point of turning the Amazon into a savanna because of taking the trees down. Will it ever go? And they use the example for 11 million years, the rainforest in Brazil existed in one size. It didn't expand, it didn't grow, it stayed basically one size and was sustainable. Some species came, some species left, but the rainforest was a self-fulfilling environment. You start hacking away at it and reduce it by 50%, it's not going to be self-sustaining. It's going to dry up, it's going to blow away into a savanna. And we lose all those trees that gobble up and eat carbon dioxide. And again, the top driver is beef production. Brazil devotes 170 million hectares. That's 7 times the size of Great Britain to cattle pasture. Most of that cattle is that beef production comes to the United States and Mexico or Great Britain. I had a figure here about the United States. A human eats 120 kilograms of beef every year. Compare that to Europe, where they eat 60 to 80. Compare it to Kenya, where they eat 16. And compare it to India, the largest country in the world now. They just surpassed India or China. They only eat 4 kilograms of beef a year on average. So 80% of farmland is for meat and dairy production globally. And 4 billion of 5 billion farmland hectares, which covers which cover all of North America and South America, is devoted to beef and dairy farming. So beef is the most damaging. It creates 25% of the meat we eat, but it only provides 2% of our calories. And yet we dedicate 60% of our farmland to beef. And so one thing we can all do is change your diet. When you talk about dramatic positives, change your diet. Don't support beef production, particularly industrial beef production, because it's extremely harmful. In this program last night I was watching, there's this firm outside of Boston that grows mushroom sheets. And they bake them in an oven, they come out flat, like a cushion. They use those for container, rather than using paper, they can use them for container. They're completely biodegradable. And they can slice them and cook them in coconut oil, and it tastes just like bacon. And so they serve them as bacon, and it's mushrooms. It's using something that's live and organic. So there's all kinds of possibilities of positive opportunities to change these tipping points. So I talked about soy. The third driver of all these trees is for palm oil, and that's primarily in Indonesia. Actually, palm oil, they cut down rainforests over in Indonesia so that they can grow palm oil and make palm oil, because it's in such a high demand, and it's a very, very injuring to our environment. Here's a scary fact. Insect numbers globally have dropped 25% in 30 years. Germany has lost 75% of the mass of flying insects, and Puerto Rico has lost 90% of the insects, that includes spiders, in its canopy. Insects are vital and crucial to all species and plant life. They don't get pollinated without insects. And so that's an alarm bell. So half of the fertile land in Earth is now formed, and unfortunately that soil now is loaded with nitrates and phosphates. We overgraze, we spray with pesticides, and then we burn it, and it becomes overused by the same crop after crop after crop. I remember a number of years ago asking Dr. Ayton, who was my personal physician at the time, as I was getting older, should I be taking some vitamins? And he talked about there is one vitamin that you might want to consider, Joe, and that would be selenium. Selenium gives you bone strength and allows you to stand up and be mobile. And he said, unfortunately, our soils are depleted of selenium. So if you're eating root vegetables or stuff that's grown, that's absorbing the nutrients in the soil, we're not getting it here because the soil has been depleted. 50 years ago, I was at a church conference and I heard a pastor from Iowa talk about, he lived on the Mississippi River, and he said, just away from the Mississippi River, he said, the topsoil used to be 20 feet high along the Mississippi Delta. Today, it's about 4 feet high because we've overused that soil and it's blown away. And so now the topsoil content of what the Mississippi River is draining that allows for all this wonderful corn production and wheat production, everything is getting lower and lower and lower. That was 50 years ago. So I worked with a lady when I worked out at Stoneport, who raised dairy cattle. And she was telling me the story about our cattle couldn't stand up. The vet came out and said, oh, that's simple. We went back, got a shot, gave him a shot. And he said, what was that? He said, that was selenium. The grain that you're feeding your cattle and what you're feeding your cattle lacks selenium. Your cattle need to have selenium to be able to have structure. So how we treat the soil in growing things it's critical to be treating it right and using it right. You see farming today going to no plow farming, using rotating crop growth. The big one is what they call vertical farming instead of horizontal farming, where you build a warehouse and you build up through water, through hydroponics and gutters, and you grow up. You utilize space. You're not giving up space for farming, but you're literally being more productive. So as humans, we adapt. We can implement these smart, positive tipping points, but you and I make individual decisions that can support that. 70% of the massive birds on our planet are domesticated. We eat 50 billion chickens a year. And at any given time, there's 25 billion chickens alive on the planet. Again, all being fed soy-based food, which we're destroying forests to all this domino effect, destroying forests to grow soy, to feed the animals that are feeding us. So 96% of the massive mammals on Earth are us and the animals we eat or raised to eat. And I love this quote by David Attenborough from his book. It says, "We have replaced the wild with the tame. We regard Earth as our planet, run by humankind for humankind. There is little left for the rest of the living world. The truly wild world, that non-human world, has gone. We have overrun the Earth." But the beauty is he comes back and he gives us a whole bunch of solutions. When I want to talk a little bit, I got one last handout. And this is because it's so current and so meaningful right now. This is we talked a little bit about, I talked a little bit about the flow of the North Atlantic current, that gyre, as they call it, the subpolar gyre. And here's some graphs about the real concern. If you look at the top graph, this was the sea surface temperature anomaly on July 31 of 2023. And you can see how many areas were above average. In some areas as high as above 90 degrees, particularly around that subarctic gyre, which is the northern United States, south of Greenland, and in that Newfoundland area, because that's where that current flows through and then comes back down off of Atlantic, right? And so then you look at the daily average sea temperatures, 70 degrees, right, on July 31. Now look at the bottom one, the daily sea surface temperatures as of February 3rd. It's 69.9 degrees way back in February, when last year it was less than that, and 2016 was less than that. And they're predicting an incredibly tough year with hurricanes. They're predicting 23 major storms, 11 hurricanes, and 5 being over a 3+ rating. Right? Normally you get 1 and a +3 rating. So they're, because of this warming temperature, they're predicting really extreme weather this year. So in fact, there are certain insurance companies that no longer insure houses in Florida, South Carolina, and California because of wildfires. Natural occurring disasters, insurance companies have pulled out of the market. That should be a red bell right there, or an indicator that people who base their living on insuring and making money on insuring are pulling out of certain markets because of the risk of environmental events. So they talk about what are the causes, and it's interesting. They're trying to figure out why is this. All the scientists are extremely alarmed why the water temperature today is so high. And they've come up with, well, it's an El Nino year last year. That could help. There was a lack of Saharan dust, which meant not enough wind to blow the Saharan dust that covers and creates a cloud base that filters the sun and keeps the ocean from getting really warm. They put this maritime rule in place a couple of years ago that made maritime vessels reduce their sulfur dioxide and diesel stuff into the air, which created clouds that prevented the sun from shining, so to speak, on the ocean. And they said, well, that wouldn't be enough, but it could have a minor effect. There was an underwater volcano near Tonga, and that spewed millions of tons of water vapor into the atmosphere. Water vapor does the same thing. It increases global warming. And in the North Atlantic, there are less clouds and less wind. Clouds blanket the sun. Wind allows water turnover, so you get colder subsurface water replacing the surface water. So just some of the things, but it's still an anomaly. And you see that's how it's an anomaly, sea surface temperature anomaly, not normal. So again, these tipping points are, I think, real, and we really need to deal with them. So Earth is, we're resilient. We've had this linear approach in the past. We'll take care of it. Things will happen. He said, take a petri dish and put some food surface in it. Let's say you put cottage cheese in a petri dish. Add bacteria. What happens? The bacteria grows. The bacteria grows and grows and grows, competes. Grows and grows and grows. Pretty soon, no food supply. What happens then? The petri dish becomes stale. It gets toxic. It smells. It burns. The bacteria die off. It's no different than our planet. We're in a big petri dish called the Earth. And the same kind of things that can happen in a petri dish of bacteria can happen to the Earth unless we take these positive actions. So talk about some of the positive things that I've mentioned a few things already. They talk about moving from an economic measure of gross domestic product to something else. And every country measures themselves based on gross domestic product. How much did we produce per person, per ton, per whatever? Did we produce more than we did last year? So political systems measure their growth based on stuff. How much stuff did we produce? How fast did we grow? So the new measure, which 2 years ago, and I went back to economic and taught economics and looked at the newer material, is the new measurements. Let's move away from gross domestic product. New Zealand dropped gross domestic product. They don't even measure it anymore. They have a wonderful prime minister, and she moved them to something called the Happy Planet Index. And the Happy Planet Index measures other kinds of issues. It measures the country's ecological footprint. Did we lower our carbon footprint? Are we producing less deleterious kinds of material that has a negative impact on the environment? Did our life expectancy go up? What is the level of happiness in our society? Are people satisfied? Are they happy? What is the level of equality in our society? I think I read somewhere that 50% of the humans' impact on Earth is attributed to the 16% richest of the human population. 50% of humanity's impact on the planet is from 16% of the people, almost like the old 80-20 principle. So one of the things that they talk about doing is measuring things other than, what about access to healthcare? What about education? How smart are your people? How broad spread is your education? How is income distributed? Those are the kinds of measurements we need to target instead of gross domestic product. So moving away from gross domestic product and talking more about those positive, sustainable things is a step. To reverse climate change, number one, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which means moving away from fossil fuels. They talked about one of the positives is the exponential growth in solar, the exponential, the growth in wind, all these in geothermal, all these renewable, sustainable sources of energy production. That's the future. Electric cars. We all got to get used to it. That's got to be the way. We got to burn less fossil fuels, and literally move away from fossil fuels that are adding to our greenhouse gas. We need to end our use of fertilizers. I mean, I used to work for a company out of Cleveland, and I used to go down there quite frequently in LTV in Cleveland. And you would see that plume of algae in Lake Erie, primarily caused from phosphate runoff from fertilizers in that agricultural area of Cleveland. They get those blue-green algae plumes that, you can't even use the lake. So we need to really get rid of and use less fertilizers, particularly chemical fertilizers. And we need to reverse the use of reducing wildlands for farmland. And we need to find better ways to farm, smarter, better ways to farm. So, from switching from fossil fuels, there are some hurdles. The first barrier is finding practical alternatives. Well, today we have solar. It's just growing immensely. I know the college is working on a grant right now to put in a big solar bank off of Woodward Avenue that would generate all the power usage of the college and extra so that they could sell it back to Alpena Power. I was just down at Michigan State or in East Lansing this past weekend, and I drove by Fee and Acres dorms, and I looked at the parking lot, the commuter parking lot, and they had all these roofs, these V-style roofs all over the parking area. I'm going, wow, that's pretty cool. They're giving protection to these students students can't drive on campus at Michigan State. They go to a commuter lot and then bus in or walk in. There were solar panels. Think about the potential of taking every parking lot and putting solar panels. You're not eliminating land for other use like growing stuff or whatever you might want to use it for. But now you're taking upward space and making it energy efficient. So I was amazed, and I went by a public parking lot off of Grand River, and the same thing. They put in solar panels over the parking lot. I thought, great idea. So we have practical solutions. Geothermal is growing. I went out to my ex-boss's house that he just built, and he put in all geothermal in his house, and he's selling electricity now to PING. So the potential is there. And the more we embrace it, the lower and more affordable it will become. And that's the second step or hurdle is affordability. But a lot of this stuff is becoming more and more affordable, and hopefully more useful. It's interesting because my wife traveled to Italy to visit our daughter who was in school over there, and she fell in love with Vespas. And so she had to have a Vespa when she come home. That's her stress release. Go for a ride on her Vespa. For 5 years, we've been asking Vespa, when you're coming out with an electric Vespa. And they said, oh, it's right in the works, right in the works. Finally, this year, they came out with an electric motor scooter. So even an Italian, company that has a long, long history and is well known is converting and knowing that there's a need for electrical travel. And the biggest hurdle to overcome is vested interests. The vested interests. All the banks and the pension funds that have money invested in gas and oil. Okay? Six of the 10 largest companies in our global environment are gas and oil. And 3 of them are state-owned. Okay? So that is huge. How we overcome the vested interests that don't want to pull away from gas and oil. I know banks made pledges a couple of years ago to start disinvesting from gas and oil companies. They haven't done it. They haven't made the mark. They've had these marks they were going to measure to, and they've fallen way, way short because they want to protect their asset growth. So we need to convince those companies, those entities that are investing in gas and oil to disinvest. And convince those gas and oil that they need to be investing in alternative energy kinds of products. Another thing that we are doing now is carbon capture storage. I know there's Iceland. Iceland, by the way, is a country that is very unique. They generate all the electricity for their whole island, not with no gas and oil. It's all renewable resources, whether it's wind, geothermal, or solar. They also do carbon capture, where they get these great big fans, whatever, however, they capture the carbon, then shoot it down underground and let the earth capture it, keep it down there. And you think about it, the history of the gas and oil, that gas and oil were plants that died many, many years ago. And they got all their energy from where? The sun. They died and they got buried and they went down and they went down and they created gas and oil. Right? And so the energy from the sun created fossil fuels. That fossil fuels are being burnt and creating carbon dioxide. It's this gigantic cycle. There are other entities that have carbon capture that are shooting into the deep of the ocean because water absorbs carbon dioxide. And it's one of our biggest carbon sinks. And so there are ways and techniques being constantly worked on to how do we do more carbon capture. The bioenergy power plants, where they're using not gas, not oil, but renewable sources, whether it's wood chips, like the plant in Lincoln and Hillman, they used to use wood chips, and to create electricity. Right? There are a new discipline in college called geoengineering, and they're working on all kinds of neat stuff. Harnessing the blooms of bacteria and algae for positive purposes. They're fertilizing the ocean with iron to make it more viable for marine life. They're pumping carbon dioxide to the bottom of the ocean. The coolest one I think that I saw was working with NASA to create a space cloud. This huge, huge fiber above our stratosphere to block the sun. Kind of like the eclipse. I don't know if any of you were outside during the eclipse, but I was doing a track meet during that, a junior high track meet. And the temperature dropped off about 10 degrees during that eclipse. And then later, about 4:30, it got warm again. I'm going, wow, I guess blocking the sun has a dramatic temperature effect. I mean, I felt it. So who knows what the future is going to bring about clouding the sun. There's been one that said we should just emit dust into the air. Like when a volcano explodes and creates millions and millions of tons of volcanic dust, it blocks the sun, it can lower the temperature. And so there's been study about how do we create dust and put it in the atmosphere to block the sun to keep our planet from cooling. All of these things that are going on actually have some after effects that we don't know about. But the process of devoting our resources, our mind power, our smarts, our intelligence to finding ways to improve our conditions, to me is heartwarming. Rewild the seas. Here's another thing we can do. I talked about these MPAs, the marine protection areas. Off of California and south of Baja, there's a huge marine protection area, no fishing. Whales were down to a count of about 300 at one point in time. And when they implemented all these MPAs and areas and countries agreed to no more whaling, the whaling population grew back up to about 10,000. So there's ways to manage your fisheries. I don't know if you're a fan of the deadliest catch, you know, the last 2 years, there was no deadliest catch. They couldn't go catch the crab because their licensing state said there's not enough. 20 million crab disappeared. We can't find them. And so we're not going to allow any crabs. No crabbing. They all turned to cod fishing or something else. The show went on, but not over crabs. So it takes good resource management and you can rewild the seas. Use smarter fishing technique. Talked about a little island called Palau. Was a very instrumental during World War II. Palau chief, they used to net fish and export all their fish. And he realized their coral reefs were being diminished. There weren't any fish there anymore. Guys would go out and not catch fish in a day. And so he said, no more fish in our coral reefs. If you want to fish, you use hook and line. And you can only catch enough fish to feed your own people. And so the Palau example worked. And they've become an example for other islands in the Pacific to implement same kind of marine protection areas. So, they talk about aquaculture. In 1995, the aquaculture industry produced about 11 million tons of fish for us to eat. Today, it's 82 million tons. Significant increase in aquaculture. If managed correctly and done right, aquaculture allows the normal native species to continue to grow, and you and I can still eat healthy fish. The other big one is kelp, our kelp forests. How you manage a kelp forest. Kelp today captures significant amount of carbon dioxide. However, they put a restriction on sea otters in California. And they went out and killed all these sea otters because the sea otters were eating urchins. Well, the urchins eat kelp. And so when they eliminated the sea otters, the kelp disappeared in the ocean. And so they said, maybe we need to reintroduce these sea otters. So they reintroduced the sea otters, which made a balance with the sea urchins, and kelp now is growing again. And it has good industrial use and nutritional use. So again, it's these kinds of positive environmental programs. The most famous example was recorded in Yellowstone, and I just want to read this quickly. Upon the reintroduction of wolves in 1995, until the wolves came back, the large deer herds spent long hours browsing the shrubs and saplings that were growing in river valleys and gorges. When the wolves arrived, that stopped. Not because the wolves ate lots of deer, but because they were scared. The deer were scared. And the routine of the deer herds changed. Now they moved frequently and did not remain in the open very long. Within 6 years, the trees grew back, shading the water, allowing fish to gather out of sight. Aspen, willow, and cottonwood thickets sprouted in the floors and the sides of the open valleys. The numbers of woodland birds, beaver, and bison increased. The wolves hunted coyote too. So populations of rabbits and mice did better, and so fox, weasel, and hawk numbers increased. Finally, even the bears grew in number as they benefited from the scavenging of carcasses left behind by the wolves. In autumn, the bears feasted on the berries of trees and shrubs that would have otherwise never come into fruit had not the wolves been reintroduced. So nature takes care of itself and balances itself. And we need to re-engineer and maintain it and understand those relationships better. And we can rewild the seas, we can rewild our land masses. And obviously take up less space. We need to reduce the growth of industrial farmland. And he uses it, there's a great example of the farmers in Netherlands. The Netherlands is the most populous country in the world per acre. They have more people per acre anywhere in the world. And in Netherlands, the farmers have learned how to be efficient. Actually, in Netherlands, where they started vertical farming, with barns, instead of growing out, you grow up. And they started hydroponics. And so Netherlands produces an extraordinary amount of food, not just to feed their own people, but people in Europe. So getting smart and doing that. And we need to plan for peak human population at 11 million. That's kind of where we need to, 11 billion. If we need to plan for that and plan correctly. And the last thing I want to leave you with is a neat story. about people who have been through climate change and survived, but in a different way than you might think. Way back in the 13th century, let's find this little story. In Arizona, there was a tribe, the tribe of Native Indians called the Huhugam, and the Huhugam were ruled over by a chief called Chief Sewanee, and they developed the Tucson and Phoenix areas, and they built huge pyramids. They irrigated 55,000 acres of land, and were very, very good farmers. They had acres and acres of crops, and the descendants of Swami tell this oral story of what happened. In the middle 13th century came this minor ice age in 1300. And this minor age brought on droughts, and famine occurred, and people revolted against the chief. They figured it was his fault because he always praised his two partners, the wind and the sun. And both of them had let him down. And so the people revolted against Swami. And so what they did is they broke apart. They said, we're no longer these great big urban, civilized, centralized development anymore. We don't trust a central chief. We trust each other. And so the tribe broke up into small groups, and they went their own way. They went back to hunting, fishing, and gathering, and some little subsistence farming, but they did it in smaller units. And the whole basis of what they call a Hainang. And a Hainang is we care for each other. We don't depend on one chief to take care of everybody. We care for one another. The abundance I have, I share with you, because someday your abundance you're going to share with me. And so in 1492, when the Eastern world came to America, they called the Indians savages. Because in Europe, how did they react to the same ice age and droughts and famine? 1 million people died in 1300 because of that weather calamity. But in Europe, they did just the opposite of what the Indians did, where the Indians became separate, small groups, subsistent on one another, and lived a subsistent lifestyle. In England, in Europe in general, they had kings and princesses and popes, and they had these dictators, and they militarized. And then they decided we need to go to other places to find resources for us. And that's why they started colonizing, and they moved to America. And when they came to America, they called the Indians savages. And when the Indians eventually went to visit in Europe, there's a famous diary from one of the visitors there, and he was Tomachichi, and he was a Creek Indian chief, or just a Creek Indian. And in 1734, he went to London, and he was staggered. He couldn't believe that a king, one man, would live in a huge palace with all these rooms. And his quote was from his diary: human, observed in English, the English knew many things his countrymen did not, but lived worse than they did. So the way Europe and the Eastern, my ancestors took these challenges was linear. They didn't take it more creatively like the Indians did in North America, who separated and became subsistence and provided for one another and had a much, much more stable life than the Europeans did. And so I'll leave you with this quote: what if, instead of doubling down on the ways we have been living, we were to do what the 13th and 14th Native North Americans did and develop more balanced and inclusive economic, social, and political systems to fit our changing climate? What if we put our highest priority on spreading prosperity and distributing decision-making more broadly? Sounds unprecedented, but it has happened before. One of the cool things about the Indians were the women had a stronger voice than the men. They had elected their leaders. Nothing could be done, war, peace, whatever, unless the women voted first. And women had an equal voice. Everyone in their society had an equal voice. Just the opposite in the 1400s. In medieval Europe, they went back to patriarchal kinds of issues, and women had no say and no input whatsoever. So there is hope. I mean, even though these issues, these global tipping points are daunting, I have faith that as humans, we're smart enough to figure it out, and we'll take actions as individuals, as groups, as society, to lessen the impact of these tipping events. So that's all I have. Yeah.
2 weeks ago, I watched the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still with Keanu Reeves in it. And I remember the Kathy Bates role said it's her job to protect our planet. And Keanu says, your planet? And she said, yes, Earth is our planet. And he says, no, it is not. And the theme as it went on is, and it's brought out by the lead scientist, is that humans, when it comes to a tipping point, it's when humans change. I kind of think that's where you're at today. When it comes to a tipping point, it's when, in fact, humans don't like people. I hate to say it.
I agree.
I
I
don't like
agree.
people. And also, I'd like to say your comment about injecting CO2 into the ocean. I just fear 1,000 years from now, some scientist is going to say, oh, wait a minute, we put CO2 in H2O, that's carbonic acid.
Yep.
Which appears to be acid. But it's still, and that's the problem with CO2 in the air. On the surface of the water mixes in, top 2 inches are kind of a carbonic acid.
Yep.
So everything we do has an effect on the planet.
Oh, it does. Absolutely. Absolutely. So here's the reference page for that globaltippingpoints.org. You can scan it and get the report if you want. So there's their QR code if you're interested in it. I'll leave those up there. So this isn't going away. It's a hot topic today. And I think the biggest thing that will get out of that tipping point, if you go read that, is we do not have a governance system to deal with this. Because globally, they all have individual interests that nobody wants to deal with it collectively and uniformly. That the issues, it's like us pulling out of the Paris Accord. Right or wrong, it doesn't lead to cohesive decision-making. No. And then, I don't know if this is a free magazine, Bridge, Michigan. It's available online. But they've had numerous recent issues, Michigan climate change. They talk about the year 2050. They figure Detroit will never get any snow after up to 220. That's how drastic our winters are changing. They've got a beautiful graph in here about the ice levels and how it's diminishing and probably not coming back because of climate change. Get used to it, Michigan. Your climate's changing. The winters you remember are going to be the winters you remember, not the winters to look forward to.
And hurricanes track warm water, which
Oh,
is why
It
those,
intensifies them.
yeah, and they follow the path of the warm
Yep.
water. So it goes so far on the East Coast now, those hurricanes.
It does. And if the Greenland ice sheet, that's the number one thing that they're worried about. If the Greenland ice sheet melts, it'll increase the sea level by 23 feet. 23 feet. And you think about all those. Well, people are going to move inland. There's going to be a migration inland. Oh, I think it'll survive, but life's going to be way different than what it is today. Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting, if that sea level goes up, it will bring cold weather to Europe, not heat. Because of the currents and the colder water that's going in from the ice will make Europe a much colder place. So the water level will go up.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.